I'm going to start this the only way that makes any sense. I'm going to start with the nail. Not the planet, not the Galactic Survey Commission report that called Verithcos biologically incompatible with all known carbon-based sentient life above Class 3. Not the part where 3 separate alien civilizations had surveyed this rock over 400 years and unanimously agreed that nothing sapient should ever try to live here. Just the nail. It was a recycled titanium nail, 8.4 centimeters long, slightly bent at the tip from where I'd already driven it halfway into a slab of synth hardwood before my hammer slipped. I'd pulled it back out, straightened it as best I could with a flat rock, and then held it between my teeth while I climbed back up to the 3rd branch of the ironwood tree I'd chosen. That branch was 11 meters off the ground. My boots were slick with something I decided not to identify. The bark under my hand smelled like copper and old smoke. Below me, through a gap in the canopy, I could see the valley floor, all mottled purple-green and misting with spores that the Galactic Survey Commission had classified as moderately lethal to unshielded biologicals. I was not shielded. My environmental suit had delaminated at the left shoulder 4 days prior. I'd patched it with a strip of polymer tape and what I can only describe as aggressive optimism. I put the nail against the wood. I hit it with the hammer. It went in clean. And I thought, okay, that's one. That's how you have to understand everything that came after, not as some grand human declaration, not as a species-wide act of defiance against an indifferent universe. Just a guy with a bent nail and a hammer, 11 meters up a tree that the Galactic Survey Commission had classified as possessing rudimentary predatory behavior, on a planet that the same commission had agreed should never be inhabited by anything that valued its own continued existence. Just a guy who needed somewhere to sleep that wasn't on the ground. Because the ground was trying to kill me, constantly, in a rotating schedule. Let me back up. My name is Jonas Marin. I'm 34 years old, or I was when this started. The math gets complicated when you factor in transit time and local calendar drift, so let's just say I'm not young enough to be stupid and not old enough to know better. I grew up in the Agridomes on New Caledonia Station, which is a human settlement about 6 transit jumps from what the Galactic Conclave calls the developed quadrant. We were not in the developed quadrant. We were in what my mother called the part of the map where the cartographers got bored and started drawing sea monsters. She wasn't entirely wrong, it turned out. I trained as a structural engineer. That's important, not because it made me brave or special or any of the things that get written into these accounts later. It made me someone who could look at a load-bearing problem and think about it in terms of vectors and weight distribution rather than instinctive panic. That's the whole qualification, honestly. I don't panic as fast as other people when something is falling. I spend those extra seconds calculating, which sometimes works out and sometimes doesn't, but it's a habit I can't shake. I ended up on Verithcos through what I'll generously call a series of contractual misunderstandings that I'm not going to litigate in this document because my lawyer said not to. The short version is this. I signed a contract to survey and assess potential habitation zones on a Class 2 biosphere. I arrived, after 3 months of transit, at a Class 6 biosphere that the Galactic Survey Commission had quietly reclassified while my ship was in transit and had failed to notify anyone in my crew about. Class 2 means mild environmental hazards, manageable local fauna, standard environmental suit protocols. Class 6 means Deathworld. The classification system doesn't mess around with that term. Deathworld is the actual official designation. Someone at the Galactic Survey Commission, at some point in the Commission's long institutional history, decided that there was a category of planet so comprehensively hostile to outside life that it deserved a name that communicated the situation immediately and without diplomatic softening. Verithkas Deathworld. My survey ship, the Cassidy Drift, could not safely land. The electromagnetic interference from the planet's iron-heavy atmosphere played hell with our navigation systems. We attempted a standard orbital insertion and immediately lost 2 of our 4 drive units to a coronal discharge that our instruments hadn't flagged as dangerous because our instruments had been calibrated for a Class 2 survey. We came down hard, not crashing. I want to be clear about that. The Cassidy Drift landed technically. It came down in a controlled descent, in the sense that we were controlling it right up until the last 40 meters, and then we were riding it down on manual thrusters and prayer, and we hit a clearing in the canopy, and the ship settled into the root system of several very large trees at an angle of about 30 degrees and didn't explode. 3 of my crew were hurt, not badly. Shen Varis had a broken wrist. Hote, our xenobiologist, had a concussion that had her confused and non-functional for 2 days. Davy, our pilot, had bruised ribs and a personality that had shifted from cautiously optimistic to actively catastrophizing and would not return to its previous setting for the rest of our time on the planet. I was fine, which I attributed at the time to having been belted in tighter than everyone else, because I always belt in tight because I have control issues. The Cassidy Drift was not fine. She was stable. She wasn't going anywhere, but she was also not flying again without significant repairs, and significant repairs required parts we didn't have, and parts we didn't have required a rescue mission, and a rescue mission required someone to know where we were, and our communications array had been knocked offline by the coronal discharge. So, there's a specific kind of clarity that descends on you when you're genuinely, comprehensively stuck. I've heard people describe it as panic. It's not exactly. Panic is what happens before the clarity. Panic is the 10 minutes of your heart trying to climb out of your chest while your brain cycles through every bad option at high speed. Clarity is what comes after when your brain runs out of bad options and just settles into, okay, what do we have? What do we need? What do we do first? What we had: a tilted ship with functional life support, 2 weeks of emergency rations, full tool inventory. I'd been meticulous about checking it before departure, which is also a control issues habit, and 4 people in various states of operational capability. What we needed: communication capability, security from local fauna, and eventually resupply. What we did first: I went outside. I know. Everyone's read Hote's account of that first hour, and she makes it sound like I just strolled off the ship like I was going to check the weather. That's not what happened. What happened is that someone needed to do a perimeter assessment, and I was the only fully operational crew member, so I pulled on what was left of my environmental suit, checked the polymer tape on the shoulder patch, and went outside. I had a plasma cutter, a geological hammer, a survival knife, and my structural engineer's habit of looking at things and thinking about their load-bearing properties. The first hour outside taught me several things. The gravity was slightly heavier than standard, about 1.1 g, enough to make you feel slightly weighted but not enough to slow you down significantly. The air was breathable through the suit filtration but thick with biological particulate that would cause problems over time without proper respiratory protection. The temperature was warm, not uncomfortable actually, in a way that I noted and filed for later. The ground was soft and constantly active with insect analogues, none of which were interested in me until I stepped on a nest of something that I can only describe as large, irritated, and fast, and then they were very interested in me. I ran back to the ship. That's when I started thinking about the trees. The trees on Verithkas, and the Galactic Survey Commission has a 19-page taxonomic report on them that I've read and that I can summarize as very large, possibly aware, definitely territorial, are unlike anything in standard galactic flora classification. The ones in our landing zone averaged between 30 and 60 meters in height. They were the ironwood variety, technically designated Farius vitae by the Commission, but called ironwood because their bark has a detectable iron content that makes them almost literally as hard as metal, and because the name tells you something true and useful about the material in a way that Farius vitae just doesn't. They grew in tight clusters, their root systems interlocked below ground so deeply that they functioned almost like a single organism. Their canopies overlapped so thoroughly that from above, I've seen the orbital survey imagery, they look like a solid surface, a rolling green-gray sea that hides everything underneath. And underneath, 11 meters up the trunk of the largest ironwood in our immediate area, was a platform. I'd spotted it on my first perimeter walk. Not a natural platform. Something had shaped the growth of several large lateral branches, either by design or by some biological accident, into a configuration that created a roughly flat surface about 4 meters by 3 meters. The branches had grown together at the joints, fusing into something that, structurally, was substantially stronger than any individual branch alone. A structural engineer sees a platform like that and thinks, foundation. I didn't build the treehouse to be clever. I didn't build it to make a point about humanity. I didn't build it because I had some ancestral memory of childhood backyard constructions and felt nostalgic. I built it because the ground was trying to kill us. The ship was compromised. We needed somewhere to sleep and work that was defensible, and there was already a functional platform up there waiting to be used. That's the whole story of why. The build took 11 days. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. 11 days of construction on a Deathworld classification planet, with a partially functional crew, limited materials, and the constant background noise of an ecosystem that was actively hostile to our presence, was genuinely one of the hardest things I have ever done. Not because I almost died specifically. I almost died several times, but each of those was a discrete incident with a clear cause and a clear response, and I handled them or I didn't, and here I am. What made it hard was the relentlessness of it. There was no break from the environment. No moment where the planet went quiet and gave you an hour. Every day had its own new problem, its own new thing that wanted to eat you or sting you or grow through your equipment overnight. You just kept working. Day 1 through 3, establishing the primary platform. I reinforced the natural branch fusion points with steel cable from the ship's emergency hardware stores and cut planking from fallen ironwood branches. The fallen ones were safer to work with than the living trees, which had a documented tendency to respond to cutting with sap that was aggressively corrosive. I built the floor platform in sections, carrying each section up separately and bolting it into place using the existing branch junctions as anchor points. Day 4, the walls. I didn't do full walls initially, I did railings, and I strung emergency mesh between them, enough to keep you from rolling off in your sleep. Enough to give you a visual sense of boundary, which matters more than people acknowledge. Your brain needs to know where safe ends. Day 5, the roof. This was the day I understood what the ironwood trees were doing. I was rigging the roof supports. I decided on a simple A-frame pitched structure to shed the rain, which came in heavy and fast every afternoon when the tree moved. Not violently, not the way you'd expect, more like a slow hydraulic adjustment, a shift in the angle of the upper branches that changed the geometry of the canopy above me and created a natural shelter over exactly the space I was working in. I stopped and watched it for a long time. The Galactic Survey Commission's report mentioned that ironwood trees demonstrated rudimentary reactive growth responses, meaning that they changed their growth patterns in response to stimuli, like many plants do, just faster and more deliberately than most. The Commission had assessed this as a passive defense mechanism against canopy competitors. I had a different theory, watching that branch adjust itself. I think the tree was helping me. I have no scientific basis for this. Hote, when I told her, said that I was anthropomorphizing, Or, technically, anthropomorphizing the wrong species, since I wasn't anthropomorphizing humans, but she got the point across. She said I was projecting intentionality onto reactive biological behavior. And she might be right. But the branches moved, and the shelter they made was exactly the shape I needed. And after that, I stopped treating the trees like construction materials and started treating them like collaborators. I talked to them while I worked, which is the kind of thing that sounds insane until you're 11 meters up a possibly sentient alien tree on a Deathworld, running on 4 hours of sleep and emergency ration bars, and you realize that talking out loud helps you think, and the tree is the only available audience. I'm going to put a crossbeam here, I'd say. Tell me if that's a problem. And sometimes the branches would shift, just slightly, and I'd take that as acknowledgement and keep working. Day 7 was the day we had our first visitor. I was up on the platform alone. Shen was managing the ship systems from inside. Davy was either catastrophizing or sleeping. It was hard to tell the difference, and Hote was beginning to recover enough to take careful notes from the ship's observation window. I was calibrating the rainwater collection system I'd rigged off the roof edge when I heard something on the trunk below me. Not the insect analogs, not the wind, something larger, something climbing. I looked over the railing. It was a wrath. If you've read the Galactic Survey Commission's fauna report on Verithcos, and if you're reading this document, you've probably been assigned it. You know what a wrath is. The Commission designates them Ophius Magnus, which means great snake thing. And while that's technically accurate, it doesn't fully communicate the experience. They're roughly 5 meters long in mature specimens. They move vertically as easily as horizontally. They have 4 specialized climbing limbs that look nothing like arms or legs and function exactly like both. Their sensory apparatus is organized around a cluster of organs on the front of the head that detect heat, chemical signature, and electromagnetic field simultaneously, which means they know things about you before you know they're there. This one was approximately at the 8-meter mark on the trunk and moving steadily upward. Toward me. I did not panic, I want to say that clearly. What I did was take a very slow, very deliberate step backward to the center of the platform, put down the rainwater calibration tool I was holding, and pick up the geological hammer, and then stand very still while I ran through my options. Option 1, go down. Going down meant going toward the wrath, which seemed counterproductive. Option 2, go higher. The next branch cluster was another 4 meters up, and I could reach it probably, but probably wasn't good enough with a 5-meter predator below me. Option 3, stay where I was, on the platform inside the railings, and find out what the wrath actually wanted. I chose option 3 because it was the option that preserved the most information, a structural engineer's habit. Before you act on a load-bearing problem, you understand the load. The wrath reached the platform level. It looked at the railing. It examined it with what I can only describe as a thoughtful expression, which is ridiculous because nothing in the Commission's report suggested wraths had facial expressions. But there it is. It was being thoughtful. Then it found the gap in the railing on the south side. The gap I'd left as an access point, specifically sized for me to move through easily, and it flowed through the gap and onto the platform. It was inside my railing. It coiled not tight, not the way a threatened animal coils, but loosely, like a dog settling onto a rug, in the corner of the platform farthest from me. It oriented its sensory cluster in my direction. Then it was still. We looked at each other for approximately 4 minutes. Then it closed its sensory cluster. The Commission's report indicated this was the wrath equivalent of closing its eyes, a posture of non-threat, and it went asleep. On my platform, I stood there for another 10 minutes, hammer in hand. Then I went back to calibrating the rainwater system, because the rainwater system needed calibrating and the Vrath was asleep, and I had no better option. Oda's notes from the observation window record that I appeared disturbingly calm for this entire sequence of events. That's fair. The distress happened internally. The external version of me keeps working. The Vrath left at dusk. It woke up, looked at me with its sensory cluster in what I now thought of as a considering expression, and then flowed back out through the access gap and down the trunk and was gone. I went inside the ship, ate an emergency ration bar, and lay on my bunk for a while staring at the ceiling. Vrath came up, I told Oda. I saw, she said. It took a nap. I saw that too. Does the commission report say anything about them doing that? She was quiet for a moment. I heard her pulling up the report on her tablet. No, she said finally. Nothing. Vrath behavior is characterized as actively predatory, solitary hunting pattern, avoids areas of strong artificial electromagnetic signature, which should describe our camp. Should be keeping them away. It didn't seem very avoided, I said. No, she agreed, it didn't. She paused. Jonas, she said, what temperature is it up on the platform in the afternoon? I thought about it. I hadn't taken a reading specifically, but the platform caught a lot of afternoon sun, and the ironwood bark radiated it back. It was noticeably warmer up there than at ground level. I told her. She was quiet again. Vraths are ectothermic, she said. They regulate body temperature through environmental heat. I understood. It came up to warm up, I said, and found somewhere elevated, sheltered from wind, with good radiant heat and no ground-level threats, she said. From a thermal comfort standpoint, Jonas, your platform is probably the most comfortable spot in a 5-kilometer radius. I thought about the Vrath, coiled loose and easy in the corner like it had found its favorite chair. Huh, I said. Yeah, she said. Day 9, there were 3 of them. Different specimens. Oda confirmed this by the variation in their scale patterning, which she was now documenting carefully from the observation window. A large one, probably the same one from day 7. A mid-sized one, and a juvenile that was barely 2 meters long and moved with the slightly uncertain energy of something that hasn't entirely figured out its own body yet. The large one took the same corner as before. The mid-sized one investigated the entire platform in a careful circuit before settling against the east railing. The juvenile tried to climb the A-frame roof supports, and I had to gently discourage this with a soft, hey, and a pointing gesture toward the platform floor, and it looked at me, and then looked at the platform floor, and then came back down and coiled up between the large one and the railing, where it went asleep immediately with its head resting on the large one's body. I was building the communications antenna array by then. Shen had figured out that we might be able to reach a relay satellite if we got our signal high enough, and I was working on a mast structure that could extend 6 meters above the platform level. I was doing the joinery on the mast sections, cutting and fitting the locking points that would let me assemble it at height, and the Vrath slept, and the afternoon sun moved, and after about 2 hours the large one opened its sensory cluster and looked at me for a while, and I said, afternoon, and it closed its sensory cluster again. Oda had her notebook out, and was writing very fast. Shen came out of the ship and climbed up to the platform to check my mast progress and stopped when he saw the Vraths. Jonas, he said, very carefully, in a voice that was doing its best not to be a scream. They're napping, I said. They're what? Napping. Ectotherms, they like the heat up here. They're not interested in us unless we do something aggressive. Just move normally. Don't make sudden loud noises. Don't step on the juvenile, that one there, the little one, and you'll be fine. Shen stood very still for a moment. The little one, he said. Yeah. It's still almost 2 meters long. It's a baby, Shen. He stood there for another moment. then very carefully sat down next to me and picked up the fitting I'd been about to work on. "I'll help," he said, "with the mast." "Thanks." We worked in silence for a while. The Vrath slept. The afternoon sun moved. A bird analog that the Commission designated Aves ferox, a 2-meter wingspan predator with a beak that the Commission described as capable of penetrating standard environmental suit material, landed on the roof ridge, looked at the Vraths, and immediately left. Shen watched this. "Did that thing just decide not to land here because of the Vraths?" he said. "Seems like it," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "So we have Vrath security." I hadn't framed it that way. "But effectively." I thought about it. "Effectively," I agreed. Day 11, I finished the Treehouse. That's an odd phrase, and I use it deliberately. The Galactic Survey Commission would later classify it as a temporary habitation structure, elevated, approximately 12 meters above grade level, and describe it in formal technical terms that communicate the specifications without communicating anything true about what it was. What it was, a room. About 4 meters by 3, the original platform dimensions. Walls, real walls now, not just mesh. I'd built them out of flattened emergency crating and synth hardwood sheets that I'd cut from the fallen branches. A pitched roof that shed rain efficiently and had a skylight I'd built from salvaged viewport material that let in the afternoon sun. A door, an actual door, on hinges I'd fabricated from the ship's hardware stores with a latch. 2 sleeping platforms built into the walls, sized for a human adult. A small work surface. Hooks for equipment. A shelf system that had started as functional storage and had, somewhere around day 9, become something I had opinions about aesthetically. I stood on the platform outside the door in the late afternoon light and looked at what I'd built. 11 meters up, warm, dry. With a rainwater system on the roof and a communications mast above that, and a view through the canopy of the valley below that was, if I'm being entirely honest, genuinely beautiful in the way that dangerous places can be beautiful. The Vraths were there in their corners. 4 of them now, the original 3 and a new one large, with a distinctive pale stripe running the length of its body that Hote had named Chalk because she was keeping records and needed something to call it. Chalk was the most watchful of them, always slightly more alert than the others, its sensory cluster rarely fully closed. I looked at Chalk. Chalk looked at me. "Welcome," I said, because I'd apparently started addressing the Vraths like house guests somewhere around day 8, and I wasn't stopping now. Chalk's sensory cluster pulsed once, a gesture that the Commission's report didn't describe, a gesture that Hote would later spend 17 pages analyzing in her own field notes. I went inside and closed the door. Part 2, the word gets out. The communications mast worked. This was not guaranteed. Shen had spent 4 days on the repair and recalibration, working with components we'd cannibalized from non-essential ship systems, and the math on whether our signal would reach the relay satellite was honestly closer to hopeful than confident. But on day 13 of our time on Verithkos, the mast went active, and after 6 hours of Shen adjusting its orientation while Hote monitored the receiver and Davy catastrophized about whether any of this mattered, we got a carrier signal. And then we got a response, and then we were talking to the Conclave relay station at Praxis 7 in halting, high-latency communication that felt like talking to someone at the bottom of a well, but was real and live and meant someone knew where we were. Davy burst into tears. "I'm not making fun of this. I nearly did too. The specific relief of knowing that you have been located by civilization, that you are a point on a map again, that someone in the known universe has your coordinates, hits in a way that's difficult to explain until you've been without it." The rescue assessment was complicated. Verithkos was Deathworld classification. A rescue ship could not simply land. Any ship approaching would need careful electromagnetic shielding, would need to navigate the coronal discharge risk, would need to approach with enough caution that the timeline for a standard rescue operation was measured in weeks, not days. Specifically, 4 weeks minimum, possibly 6. We had enough rations for 2.5 weeks, if we were careful. We had a Deathworld. We had a Treehouse. We made it work. The food situation was Hote's department, and Hote, still recovering from the concussion, moving slowly, taking more naps than she'd probably like anyone to document, was nonetheless the person on our crew most equipped to assess local biological resources. Her methodology was careful. She would not eat anything that the Vraths didn't ignore, on the theory that apex predators on their home world had a reliable instinct about what was and wasn't going to kill them. She spent the better part of 2 days observing what the Vraths brought to the platform. They'd started doing this, around day 14, bringing things up and leaving them, and testing those things against our ship's biochem analyzer. What the Vraths brought us, mostly dead prey animals, which was simultaneously touching and slightly horrifying. A large, smooth-shelled fruit that Hote's analyzer rated as nutritionally adequate and non-toxic. Bundles of something fibrous that turned out to be a plantanologue with significant protein content when processed correctly. "They're providing," Hote said. She was sitting with her notebook on the platform, watching Chalk arrange a collection of the smooth-shelled fruit into a rough pile by the door. "This is provisioning behavior. They're treating the treehouse as a territory they're invested in." "Are we prey?" Shen asked. He was always a step behind on this kind of thing, processing the predator implications before the mutualism ones. I'd started doing the reverse. "No," Hote said firmly. "If we were prey, we'd be prey. Vraths don't play with their food. The commission report is very clear on that. This is something else." "What else?" Davy asked. Hote considered it. "I think they've accepted us as part of their territory," she said slowly. "The treehouse is a warm, elevated, predator-deterrent location. By using it, and by allowing us to remain there, they've incorporated it into their daily circuit. And what you do with things in your territory that are useful and non-threatening." "You maintain them," I said. She looked at me. "You maintain them," she agreed. The Vrath who started all the trouble, who set the domino falling that led to everything that came after, was one I'd been calling Scar, for the tissue-pale line along its left flank that suggested an old wound, something big and diagonal that had healed well but hadn't healed invisibly. Scar was not from our regular group. Our regular group, Chalk, the original large one I'd started calling first, the mid-size one Hote had named Herring for reasons she declined to explain, and the juvenile we were all calling Little because no one could agree on anything more specific, had settled into a comfortable daily pattern. Morning arrival, afternoon heat soaking, departure before dark, occasional food deposits. A general air of mutual tolerance that had, I realized somewhere around day 16, actually become mutual warmth. I looked forward to seeing them arrive. I'd started leaving the door unlatched so the juvenile could push it open if it wanted to come inside, which it sometimes did, coiling up on the floor between the sleeping platforms like a draft excluder with opinions. Scar arrived on day 17. Arrived is the right word. There's something about the way a Vrath comes into a new space that has a quality of announcement to it, a deliberateness that's different from the settled movement of familiar occupants. Scar came up the trunk in the middle of the afternoon, when all 4 of the regulars were there, and stopped at the platform edge and moved its sensory cluster in a long, slow arc that covered the whole platform and all the people on it. First raised its own head, not aggressively but alertly, a notice. Scar came through the gap in the railing. What followed was, I believe, a negotiation. It lasted about 20 minutes. The Vraths moved relative to each other in ways that were too precise to be random and too subtle for me to decode. And at the end of it, Scar was coiled on the platform, and the others had rearranged to accommodate it, and the platform had gone from 4 Vraths to 5. I was watching from just inside the door. After the rearrangement settled, Chalk looked at me. Its sensory cluster pulsed in the way I'd started to think of as deliberate communication. "Friend of yours," I said. The pulse again. "Okay," I said, "welcome." Scar changed things. Not immediately, not dramatically, but Scar was different from the others in a way that took me a few days to identify, and when I identified it, I went and sat with it for a while. Scar was injured. The old wound on its flank was old, but there was something recent happening too. The way it moved had an uneven quality, a slight favoring of the right side, a hesitation in certain positions that the others didn't share. Hote confirmed it after watching for a day. Something was wrong with the left side musculature, probably an old injury that hadn't fully resolved, probably aggravated recently. "It's using the heat," Hote said. "The radiant heat from the platform and the bark, thermal therapy. It's coming here because it's in pain and the warmth helps." I thought about that for a while. On day 21, I built a heating element. Not a high-tech installation. I took a power cell from the ship's secondary systems, low drain, stable, rated for long operation, and connected it to a simple resistance heating element that I mounted flush into the south wall of the platform, the wall that got the least sun. I covered it with a plate of ironwood bark that would distribute the heat evenly and not heat up enough to be a fire risk. I calibrated it to about 32 degrees Celsius, warmer than the ambient platform temperature, the kind of warmth that goes into deep muscle. Scar found it on the first day, coiled against the south wall with the slow, deliberate positioning of something that has located an exact comfort and is committing to it. Lay there for 6 hours. When it left, there was a subtle change in the way it moved. The favoring of the right side was less pronounced. "Jonas," Hote said quietly, "you just built a Deathworld monster, a heated therapy platform." "I built a heating element," I said. "You built it specifically for Scar." "I built it because the south wall gets no sun, and the temperature differential was inefficient." She gave me the look she gave me when I was being technically accurate and emotionally dishonest simultaneously. "Okay," I said. "Yes, I built it for Scar." She wrote something in her notebook. "What did you write?" I said. "Subject demonstrates prosocial behavior across species boundary despite acknowledging hostile environmental context," she said. "This may be either very significant or very inadvisable, possibly both." "That's accurate," I said. "I know," she said. The word got out. I don't know exactly how. Hote has theories about Vrath communication, about chemical signaling and territory marking, and the way information moves through what she started calling their landscape network. The overlapping territorial circuits that connect all the Vraths in a given region. What I know is the effect, which is that around day 25 the number of Vraths coming to the platform started increasing. First it was 5, then 7, then 9. Then we had a day when I counted 14, which was substantially more Vraths than the platform was designed to accommodate, and which required some honest assessment of structural capacity. I reinforced the primary beam supports on day 26 and added a secondary platform level, smaller, accessible from the south side, that gave additional space. The 14 sorted themselves between the 2 levels, by some Vrath logic I couldn't follow, but that seemed to satisfy everyone. Hote was documenting all of this with the focused joy of someone who has stumbled onto the find of her career and knows it. Her concussion recovery coincided with the expansion of the Vrath visitation pattern, and she was, in her words, incandescent with curiosity, which translated practically into 17-hour days of observation and note-taking and periodic requests for me to count specific Vraths while she recorded positions. Shen had started modifying the communications array to add sensor capability. He was recording the electromagnetic fluctuations that the Vraths produced, building a dataset that he was becoming increasingly excited about. "They're talking," he kept saying. "Not in sound, in field variations. Jonas, they're talking." Davy had stopped catastrophizing. This was the most remarkable change. Around day 22, after a long afternoon in which he sat on the platform with 8 Vraths sleeping around him and nothing bad happened, Davy had undergone some internal shift. He was still quiet, still watchful, but the quality of his watchfulness had changed from the scanning vigilance of someone looking for threats to something more like the alert attention of someone, finding everything genuinely interesting. He'd started drawing. Careful, detailed drawings of the Vraths in a sketchbook he'd found in his personal gear, documenting their scale patterns, their limb configurations, the exact geometry of their sensory clusters. He wasn't saying much, but the drawings were extraordinary. The Galactic Survey Commission rescue ship, the Persistent Inquiry, a mid-size research vessel that had been repurposed for rescue operations, because the proper rescue vessel was 3 weeks out, and the Persistent Inquiry was only 5 days away once we established communication, entered Verithkos orbit on day 29 of our planetary stay. Their approach was cautious. They had our coordinates, they had our status reports, they had Hote's preliminary field notes which she'd transmitted in pieces over the communications mast. They also had the Galactic Survey Commission's full Deathworld assessment of Verithkos, which meant their approach was the kind of careful that involves a lot of checking and rechecking. The Persistent Inquiry's commander was a Dreth named Vaskar Itum. Dreth are, I should describe this, because not everyone reading this will be familiar, tall, narrow-bodied beings, 6-limbed, with a sensory arrangement focused on their upper surface rather than their front. They perceive the universe differently than most bilateral species in a way that affects their cognition. They're excellent at processing multiple simultaneous inputs, slightly less capable of the focused linear attention that humans default to. Vaskar was a 12-year veteran of the Commission and had done 2 previous Deathworld survey operations, both carefully orbital. She had never landed on a Deathworld. "Standard procedure for Deathworld rescue," she told us over the communication link during our first live exchange, "is aerial extraction. We lower a shielded transport pod, you board the pod, we bring you up. Land time for Commission Crew 0. "I understand," I said. "We can begin extraction sequence in approximately 47 of your hours, time needed for electromagnetic navigation preparation." "I understand," I said again. "I want to give you some updated information about the landing site before you begin." There was a pause. Not a communication delay pause. The signal was much better now. The mast was doing its job, but a processing pause. The kind where whoever is on the other end is deciding what kind of information might follow that statement. "Proceed," Vaskar said. "We have, currently, 19 Vrathon, or immediately around our primary habitation structure. I want to be sure your aerial approach accounts for that, because if the pod transit disturbs them, I'd prefer to manage that on the ground rather than have your crew manage it from above." Another pause. "You have 19 what?" Vaskar said. "Vrath. The Commission designates them Ophius Magnus. They've been using our elevated platform structure as a thermal rest site since approximately day 7 of our stay. They're habituated to our presence and non-aggressive as long as—" "Marin." Vaskar's voice had taken on a quality I'd come to associate, in humans at least, with someone trying very hard not to sound as alarmed as they felt. "The Commission's Vrath behavioral assessment describes them as—" "I know what the Commission's assessment says," I said. "I've read it. I'd like to suggest that it's incomplete. Dr. Bream has approximately 40 pages of field notes that document behavioral patterns not covered in the existing literature. I think the Commission will find them significant." A longer pause. 40 pages, Vaskar said. She's thorough, I said. Part 3, the luxury hotel. What happened next is the part of this account that has been most widely circulated, most frequently discussed, and most consistently mischaracterized. Let me tell you what actually happened. The persistent inquiry completed its electromagnetic navigation preparation and moved into position for the aerial extraction on day 31. Vaskar had communicated her extraction plan in detail. A shielded transport pod would descend on a cable system, hover at approximately 5 meters above the treehouse platform, and we would use a boarding ladder to transfer to the pod one at a time with our equipment. What no one had discussed in detail was what the Vraths would make of this. I'd been thinking about it. I talked to Scar about it, literally talked to Scar, which I acknowledge is not a scientifically rigorous methodology, but Scar had been my most consistent company on the platform for 2 weeks, and I'd developed the habit, and Scar had done its considering look, the long sensory cluster assessment, and then gone back to lying against the warm wall. I took this as, if not reassurance exactly, at least not warning. The pod descended at 1400 local time, which was prime Vrath napping period. It came down slowly, on a magnetic stabilization cable that kept it from swinging in the upper canopy wind. It was about 3 meters in diameter, brushed metal surface, with approach lighting that I'd asked Vaskar to set to low intensity so it wouldn't be alarming. 23 Vraths were on, or immediately around the platform. I was standing at the edge of the upper level, watching the pod come down, and I could feel, I'm going to use that word deliberately, I could feel the attention of the Vraths sharpening around me, a change in the quality of their stillness, not the relaxed warmth of napping, something more alert. First raised its head. Its sensory cluster was fully extended, oriented at the pod. The pod slowed and stopped at 5 meters up as planned. The boarding ladder dropped. It swayed in the wind. First looked at the ladder. Then first looked at me. And I don't know how to explain the next 20 seconds except to say that something passed between me and a 5-meter Deathworld predator that I can only characterize as communication. First looked at the pod. First looked at the ladder. First looked at me. And I said, it's okay. It's our ride. It's going to take us home. First sensory cluster pulsed, twice. Then first lay back down. Vaskar's voice came through my earpiece. Marin, the Vrath just, are you in danger? No, I said, we're fine, we're going to start boarding. The Vrath is. Vaskar, we're fine, please trust me on this. We boarded one at a time. Shen first, because he was the lightest and I wanted to test the ladder in current conditions. Then Davy, with his sketchbook under his arm, who paused at the top of the ladder and looked back at the Vraths for a long moment before he went up. Hote, who paused much longer and said something quietly in a language I didn't recognize. Later she told me it was Malay, a language her grandmother spoke, and what she said was a phrase for leaving a place with respect. Then me. I was the last one up. I stood on the platform for a moment before I grabbed the ladder, looking at the Vraths, 23 of them. First and Chalk and Herring and Little and Scar and 18 others whose scale patterns I could distinguish but hadn't named, and who had chosen, for reasons entirely their own, to spend their afternoons in a space built by a species they'd never encountered, warmed by a heating element installed by hands they'd never seen before, trusting in something that they had no evolutionary reason to trust. I put my hand on the ironwood door frame. The bark was warm. Thank you, I said, to the tree, to the Vraths, to the planet, to all of it, for the hospitality. I climbed the ladder. From the pod, through the port window, I watched the platform as we ascended. The Vraths didn't move. They didn't disperse. They stayed exactly where they were in their corners, against the warm wall, coiled in the configurations they'd found comfortable, and watched the pod rise with their sensory clusters oriented upward, until the canopy closed beneath us and they were gone. Vaskar was in the pod. She'd insisted on coming down personally, which Shen had told me was unusual for a commission commander. She was looking out the same port window I was. They didn't move, she said. Not a question, just a statement of observed fact, the tone of someone recalibrating. They live there, I said. For them, we were guests. Vaskar looked at me for a moment. Her visual organs have four, arranged in a square on their upper surface, oriented toward me in a way that felt like full attention. The commission report, she said carefully, classified the Vrath as apex non-social predators. The commission report was written from orbital data and one atmospheric survey pass, I said. We spent 31 days with them. She was quiet. What did you learn? She said. We spent 4 days on the persistent inquiry before making the first transit jump toward the Praxis 7 relay station. Hote spent most of those 4 days in conference with Vaskar and the persistent inquiry science team, presenting her field notes with the careful precision of someone who has been sitting on a scientific bombshell for a month and is very ready to share it. I spent most of those 4 days sleeping, because I hadn't done enough of it in 31 days. And eating real food, which tasted extraordinary in the way that everything tastes extraordinary when you've been living on emergency ration bars. And sitting in the observation lounge at night, looking at the stars, thinking. Davy found me in the observation lounge on the second night. He sat down across from me without saying anything, which was a new Davy. The old Davy would have said several things immediately, most of them about things going wrong. We sat quietly for a while. I drew a picture for you, he said eventually, and held out his sketchbook. It was little, the juvenile Vrath, rendered in careful pencil lines, coiled on the treehouse floor between the 2 sleeping platforms, with its head resting on the edge of my sleeping platform, looking up with its sensory cluster open. It was a good picture. It captured something true. Thank you, I said. I think I understand it now, Davy said. Why you kept working, why you just kept going. What do you understand? He thought about it. A place can be dangerous and still be home, he said. The danger and the homeness aren't opposites. They're just both true at the same time. I looked at the drawing of Little. Yeah, I said, that's it. Vaskar submitted a preliminary field assessment to the Galactic Survey Commission 14 days after our departure from Verithkos. I've read the full document. It's reproduced in the Commission's public archives, and I'll give the reference number at the end of this account. The relevant section, the part that led to everything that followed, reads as follows in the translated summary. Evidence gathered during Rescue Operation GSR 7741 indicates significant inadequacy in existing behavioral and biological assessments of Verithkos Class 6 fauna, specifically the Vrath Ophius magnus. Human settler Jonas Marin, through construction of an elevated habitation platform within Vrath territorial range, achieved sustained non-aggressive interspecies contact over 31 days. Observed behavioral repertoire of Vrath significantly exceeds parameters of existing Commission classification. Recommend comprehensive xenobiological review, reclassification of Vrath behavioral designation, and further study of human-Vrath interaction patterns documented in attached field notes, BREAM, O, 47 pp. Additionally, recommend investigation of ironwood tree reactive behavior as documented in Marin J. personal account, which may indicate classification as reactive sentient biological system rather than passive flora. That report led to the first Commission-sanctioned return mission to Verithkos. The return mission found the treehouse intact. They found 27 Vraths on or around it. Part 4, the guests. I went back. Of course I went back. Anyone who has read this far and is surprised by this hasn't been paying attention. I went back 14 months after the rescue, on the first commission-sanctioned research mission. Hote was the mission lead. She'd fought for that assignment with a focused intensity that had apparently made several commission administrators genuinely uncomfortable, and she'd won. Shen came because he'd been building out his electromagnetic monitoring equipment for 11 months and needed field data. Davy came because he was Davy, and he'd be damned if he was left out, and also because he'd been commissioned by the Xenoanthropological Society to produce a visual record of the mission. I came because it was mine. That's the honest truth of it. I came because I'd built something there that was mine in a way that was hard to articulate and impossible to abandon. The Galactic Survey Commission had reviewed my construction, the treehouse, the platform, the heating element, the communications mast, and classified it as an unauthorized permanent structure on a restricted biosphere, which I had been officially reprimanded for. I had accepted the reprimand. I'd also quietly pointed out to the commission representative who delivered it that the unauthorized permanent structure was currently housing 27 members of a species that the commission had misclassified as non-social, and was therefore generating more accurate xenobiological data per square meter than any authorized commission installation on the planet. The reprimand was not rescinded, but the installation was reclassified as a field research station, retroactively authorized. Progress. Landing the second time was different from landing the first time. The commission had sent a proper atmospheric survey in advance, had mapped the electromagnetic activity patterns, had designed a descent approach that avoided the coronal discharge risk. The ship we came in on, the parallel lines, a research vessel with a proper landing capability, came down clean in a cleared area about 200 meters from the Treehouse ironwood. I stepped off the ship and the air hit me. The smell of Verithkas, copper and green and something deep underneath that I'd never been able to name, something that was just the specific biological signature of this specific planet. The way every place has its own smell that you don't notice until you've been away and come back. I stood there for a moment. Hote appeared beside me. "Well," she said. "Yeah," I said. We walked toward the treehouse. They were there before we reached the base of the ironwood. First, which I recognized immediately, the scale pattern is distinctive. I'd know it anywhere. And Chalk, and Little, who was noticeably larger than 14 months ago, growing into the uncertain energy of adolescence, and others I didn't recognize, new ones, part of the expanded population that the Commission's remote sensors had been tracking. First came toward us across the ground, which was unusual. The Vraths typically stayed elevated, but first moved across the ground in a direct line toward me and stopped about 2 meters out and raised its head, and its sensory cluster was open, fully extended, oriented at my face. I stood very still. "Hello," I said, "I'm back." First sensory cluster pulsed, twice. Same as the last time. Then first turned and flowed toward the ironwood and up the trunk, and I followed, and we went home. The treehouse had changed. Not structurally, my construction had held. The walls were sound, the roof had done its job through one of Verithkas's wet seasons and showed only expected weathering. The door still latched. But it had changed in other ways. Things had been left in it. Not by the Commission's remote monitoring team. They'd been strictly instructed not to enter the structure, only to observe from distance. By the Vraths. In the corner where Scar always rested, a collection of objects, smooth stones water-worn in a configuration that was too deliberate to be random. A section of shed Vrath scale, intact, the length of my arm. Several of the smooth-shelled fruit desiccated now, but arranged on the shelf I'd built with a care that was, I stared at this for a long time, a care that was ornamental, not random placement, arrangement. "Hote," I said. She was already in the room, already writing. She looked up. "I see it," she said quietly. "What does it mean?" She looked at the arrangement on the shelf for a long moment. "I have a theory," she said. "I want more time before I say it out loud." She would say it out loud, eventually, in the paper that got her the Xenobiological Institute's highest recognition and sparked a field-wide debate about Vrath cognitive classification. The short version of the theory: the Vraths had been maintaining the treehouse. Not just occupying it, maintaining it, in a way that incorporated elements of behavioral patterns normally associated with territorial marking, and she argued, with something she called material culture, the deliberate use of objects to mark, communicate, and preserve information. The arrangement on the shelf was communication. It was saying we were here, we remember. We stayed for 3 months. Those 3 months are documented in Hote's field notes, now in 12 volumes, which the xenobiological community is still working through, in Shen's electromagnetic monitoring data, which has, since analysis, required a partial revision of the Commission's understanding of Vrath sensory communication, and in Davi's visual record, which became an exhibition that traveled to 11 conclave worlds and which I have seen twice. Once at the opening, and once alone late in the run when I wanted to sit with it quietly. I'm not going to reproduce all of that here. What I want to tell you is the specific things, the small ones, that don't make it fully into the scientific accounts. Scar came back on the 3rd day of our return. I saw it coming up the trunk in the afternoon and felt something that I can only call recognition, not surprise, not alarm, just the simple recognition of a familiar presence. Scar moved the same as before, the favoring of the right side somewhat improved but still present. It went directly to the south wall. The heating element was still there, still connected to the same power cell which had more than enough charge left. I turned it on. Scar lay against the wall and was still. After an hour, I sat down on the floor across from it. I had notes to review, construction assessments, list of modifications and expansions the Commission was authorizing, but I just sat there for a while. Scar's sensory cluster was half closed, the resting position, but it opened periodically and oriented at me, and then closed again, the rhythm of something that is not quite asleep and not quite awake. I thought about this place, I said, a lot. When I was back home, I kept thinking about all of you. The cluster opened, considered closed. I'm glad we came back, I said. A slow pulse. I went back to my notes. The thing that most people ask when they hear this story is some version of, but weren't you afraid? And the honest answer is, yes, constantly. Not the sharp, immediate fear of specific threat, though there was plenty of that, but the low, continuous fear that lives under everything on a Deathworld. The awareness that the environment wants you not to exist. The knowledge that your suit can fail, your shelter can fail, your equipment can fail, your body can fail in ways that the planet will be entirely indifferent to. You carry that fear. But here's what I learned, or maybe what I relearned about fear. It's not the opposite of safety. You can be afraid and still be somewhere you belong. You can be afraid and still make a home. The Vraths live in the same environment. Their bodies are more adapted to it than mine, sure, but they still live in a place that will kill them if they make the wrong choices, if they're injured at the wrong time, if they find themselves alone and vulnerable in the wrong circumstances. Every living thing on Verithkos lives with that awareness. And they still sleep in the afternoon sun. They still bring things to each other. They still apparently arrange small objects on a shelf to say, we were here, we remember. On day 47 of the return mission, we had our first non-Vrath visitor. A Kreth survey team. Kreth are I'm going to need a moment here, because describing Kreth to non-xenologists requires some patience. They're roughly half the size of a human, bilaterally symmetric, with a surface texture that I will diplomatically describe as armored, and a smell that my human nose registers as industrial solvent. They are among the most analytically precise species in the galactic conclave, and they have an institutional distrust of biological variables, which means they approach xenobiological research with the kind of skepticism that results in very rigorous methodology, and also sometimes very uncomfortable conversations. The Kreth survey team had 3 members. Their lead researcher, whose designation translated roughly as 5th analytical of the 3rd cohort survey division, insisted on being called 5th because she'd been dealing with non-Kreth for long enough to know that the full designation was impractical. 5th had read Hote's preliminary field notes. She had opinions about them. The behavioral documentation is inconsistent with established Vrath classification parameters, she told Hote, within approximately 6 minutes of arriving on the platform. She was small enough that she could stand upright inside the treehouse without ducking, which she seemed to appreciate. The prosocial indicators described in your notes require significant additional documentation before classification revision can be considered. I agree, Hote said pleasantly. That's why we're here documenting. The human's role in initiating the behavioral shift is also not adequately analyzed. Also why we're here. 5th looked at me. I was sitting on the floor, reviewing construction modification plans. The floor was more comfortable since Hote had suggested adding a woven mat, which I'd built from stripped ironwood bark fiber, and which was softer than you'd expect given the material. You're Marin, 5th said. Yes. You built this structure. Yes. Why did you build it here? The commission survey data indicates several alternative elevated sites within 2 kilometers. The tree helped me, I said. 5th stared at me. The tree, she said. The ironwood. The branches moved to support the construction. I've detailed it in my account. Your account describes subjective interpretation of reactive growth behavior. I know, but it happened and I made a choice and I built here. I looked at the walls, the door, the heating element on the south wall, and it worked out. 5th was quiet for a moment. The commission report on ironwood reactive behavior has been flagged for review, she said finally. That is separate from the Vrath documentation but related, if the ironwood demonstrates directed interaction capability. Then this whole thing gets more complicated, I said. Significantly, she said. We looked at each other. You should stay, I said. There's space on the 2nd level. The Vraths will be here this afternoon. I'll introduce you. 5th surface armor did something I would later learn was the Kreth equivalent of an eyebrow raise. Introduce me, she said. To the Vraths. They're habituated to new people now, but it helps if there's a formal introduction. I can't explain exactly how it works. You have to watch first sensory cluster response. 5th was quiet for a long time. I will stay, she said finally, for documentation purposes. Good, I said. The afternoon is the best time. Bring something to sit on. 5th stayed for 6 weeks. By the end of week 2, she had stopped arguing with Hote's methodology and started contributing to it. By the end of week 4, she had a specific spot on the upper level that was hers. The Vraths knew it was hers and gave her room, and she had developed what I can only describe as a rapport with Little, who seemed to find her armor texture interesting and had a habit of resting its head against her back in a way that 5th categorized in her notes as possibly investigative. But that looked, from every external vantage point, exactly like affection. Her final report to the Kreth Survey Division is in the Conclave archives. The relevant conclusion reads, Human established habitation structure on Verithkos, Gar 7741, local designation Marin Station, has generated xenosocial interaction data of significant value. The phenomenon of Vrath behavioral modification in response to human construction activity represents a case study in unintentional first contact protocol that merits deeper integration into standard xenological training frameworks. The human tendency to anthropomorphize is noted as a methodological risk, but is also, paradoxically, responsible for the initial success of the interspecies contact, suggesting that in specific contexts, emotional projection may function as a valid first contact tool rather than simply as a cognitive error. Fifth sent me a copy with a personal note attached. The personal note said, "Little push through my tent wall last night trying to get warm. I can see why you find them difficult to leave. I find them difficult to leave." That's the simplest truth of this whole account. I've been back to Verithcos 5 times now. The Commission has built a proper research station, electromagnetic shielded, properly staffed, with full life support and a rotating crew of researchers from 12 different species. The station is good work, important work. The scientific output from Verithcos in the 3 years since that first unauthorized landing has substantially revised the Commission's understanding of Deathworld ecology in general and Vrath behavioral taxonomy specifically, with implications that are still spreading through xenobiological literature. The research station is 140 meters from the Treehouse Ironwood. The Vraths use the research station too, now. The researchers have built thermal platforms at the station's suggestion, Commission-approved, properly installed, monitored. The Vraths use them. But the population on the Ironwood Treehouse has never decreased. If anything, it's grown. There are currently, according to the last count Hote sent me, 31 regular visitors and a rotating population of occasional ones. The Commission researchers have names for all of them. The juvenile little is now an adolescent who is, by Hote's reckoning, significantly larger than either First or Chalk, and who will probably be the dominant territory holder in this area within a few years. The south wall heating element is still running on the original power cell. I've left instructions for it to be maintained. Part 5, What the Tree Knew. I want to tell you about the last thing. The thing that the Commission is still debating. The thing that Hote has submitted 3 papers on, and Fifth has submitted 4 counterpapers on, and that will probably not be resolved in my lifetime because the evidence is real, and the implications are profound, and the scientific community needs time with that kind of thing. The Ironwood tree. I told you at the beginning that I thought the tree helped me, that the branches moved to accommodate my construction, that the canopy adjusted to create shelter, that the whole structure of the tree participated in what I was doing in a way that felt cooperative rather than passive. Hote documented the tree throughout the first return mission. Shen's monitoring equipment, which was calibrated for electromagnetic fluctuation, picked up something in the ironwood that they hadn't expected. A regular, low-level electromagnetic pulse, not random, not caused by environmental factors, cycling on a period of approximately 11 seconds. 11 seconds. The Commission's xenobotanists reviewed the data. They had 2 explanations: natural piezoelectric activity in the iron-rich bark, which was known, or something else, which was not. On day 62 of the return mission, Shen recalibrated his equipment to monitor the ironwood pulse pattern over a 24-hour period. The pulse pattern changed when the Vraths were present. Not randomly, consistently. The pulse rate increased during peak Vrath occupancy of the platform, decreased when the Vraths left, had a specific pattern: 3 pulses, pause, 2 pulses, that occurred only when First was present and not with any other Vrath. It knows them, Shen said. He said it quietly, in the voice of someone who has discovered something significant and isn't ready to say it loudly yet. Jonas, the tree knows them. I was standing at the base of the trunk, my hand on the bark. The bark was warm. I know, I said. We don't know how. That's the honest state of it. We know the pulse exists. We know the correlation. We have 3 years of monitoring data that confirms the correlation across changing conditions, different Vrath populations, different researchers, different equipment setups. We don't know what it means. We don't know whether the tree is aware, in any sense that word is meaningful. We don't know whether the correlation is communication or recognition or something else entirely for which we don't have a word yet. What we know is what I've always known, which is that the tree helped me. And that's something about this specific ironwood, this platform in the canopy with its south wall heat and its view of the valley and its smell of copper and old smoke, was already set up to welcome something. I just happened to be the thing that showed up. The Commission's current official position on Verithkas is Class 6 biosphere with documented interspecies mutualism potential, which is a significant departure from biologically incompatible with all known carbon-based sentient life above Class 3. Progress. The Vrath are now classified as eusocial apex predators demonstrating distributed territorial culture and cross-species mutualism capacity, which is a significant departure from actively predatory, solitary hunting pattern, avoids areas of strong artificial electromagnetic signature. Progress. The ironwood trees are classified as biologically reactive organisms with unresolved electromagnetic activity patterns under continued investigation, which is the Commission's careful, evidence-respecting way of saying, we don't know what these trees are doing, and we're not ready to commit to an answer. Also progress. That's what we don't know yet looks like institutionally. It looks like under continued investigation. I'll take it. I'm going to end this account with the last time I was on the platform. Last autumn. Local autumn. Verithkas has a wet season and a dry season and the transition between them, when the air shifts from saturated to clear, and the color of the canopy changes from deep green-gray to something almost gold, is the most beautiful thing I've personally witnessed in 35 years of living in the universe. I was there for that transition, alone for a week before the next research rotation arrived. Hote was at the Xenobiological Institute presenting. Shen was at a conference on electromagnetic biosensing. Davy was in a gallery for the opening of a new exhibition. Just me. And the Vraths. First was there every day in the old corner, the one that catches the afternoon sun through the skylight I built. Chalk was there. Little was there, larger every time I saw it, no longer juvenile in any sense that mattered. Scar was there, against the south wall, against the heat, moving a little less stiffly than before. 31 of them, over the course of the week, cycling through in their daily patterns. And me sitting on the woven mat, reading, writing this account, drinking tea from the system I'd installed on the third return trip, watching the canopy turn gold. On the last morning, before the research rotation arrived and the platform filled with people and equipment and the busy productive noise of science, I sat very still in the early light. First was there already, in the corner. The tree's pulse was doing its 3-2 pattern, slowly, steadily. The morning air on Verithkas smells different from the afternoon air. Crisper, cleaner, less biological particulate saturated, for reasons that have to do with temperature stratification and spore settling that I can explain but don't need to hear. In the early morning before the heat builds, the air is almost gentle. I sat with that for a while. Then I said to the tree, to all of it, I don't know how to explain you to people who haven't been here. I've been trying for 3 years. I'm still trying. First sensory cluster opened, oriented at me. The closest I've come, I said, is this. You taught me that home isn't a place you find. It's a place you make. And making it changes the place and the place changes you, and after a while you can't tell which changed first. You just know that something mutual happened. The cluster pulsed. Twice. Yeah, I said, that.